Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Welcome to Microsoft Research. My name is Mary Gray, and I'm a senior researcher here. Like, what am I? And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our colloquium speaker, Dorothea Kleine. She's a senior lecturer at the University of London, and she's going to talk with us today about her fieldwork, which is available in book form. Fantastic book. There's one more up here, just to hawk her book for her. So please join me in welcoming Dorothea.
Hi everyone. Thanks Mary for the invite, and it's a great pleasure to be here. There's some people that I met before at different talks here in Cambridge and at different other occasions, and it's lovely to kind of see you again. And I've sort of got a vague idea that's because we have some common interests, and I want to hear a lot about that also in questions. I will. I can find on. That's on mine. Okay, is that on? Can you hear me? Yeah, that's good. Oh, it might be too low. I think that might be fine. Okay. I'm going to move the mic up. Okay. Right. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, and they can just fiddle with the sound, I think. Yeah.
I mean, I can look close, but
fair enough. I'll do the Queen's Lecture Theatre voice, which is our biggest lecture theatre. So I'll project. Okay. Talking about the Queen's Lecture Theatre. Okay, so Royal Holloway is part of the University of London. So that's the college that I work at, where we have a centre in ICT 4D, which means Information and Communication Technologies for Development. So that's kind of our group of people. And I thought I'd give you just a quick overview what we do before I go into my specific work and my specific study. So we've basically a group of people, 10 PhD, 11 staff, who are in different disciplines, including geography, management, and computer science. And we work on subfields like this: access, illiteracy, government participation, and so on. Stakeholders, very broadly, multi-stakeholder as well. And these are some themes that we work with. For this talk in particular, you'll find themes such as value-sensitive design and gender in particular coming up. So that just gives you an idea of the breadth of work that's going on. If you want to find out more, we've got here ICT for DC is our website, and this basically brings together blog posts from our members and the kind of Twitter feeds from different members and information about our events and so on. So if you're interested in the breadth of what we're doing, that's what you might want to consider. Also give you an idea how we link to business, because we're right here at Microsoft. So basically we work with business on research projects. We have collaborative work on studentships, masters and PhDs. We have some sponsored scholarships, in particular for students in the Global South. We do consultancy, but we also do short courses for business, and particularly methodological courses as well. And there's a master's program that we run which is in sustainable development. So it brings together environmental and development aspects, and there's a specialism in that which is on ICT and development. If any of that is of interest to you, there's like some flyers at the back as you go out. You can just pick up some stuff. This is my own kind of research universe at the moment. Quick capture there. I think that's possibly true for many academics, that they struggle to have it all captured in just one bubble. So my bubble is like two bubbles and a hat. So the hat is applying the capabilities approach to human development and well-being. I'll talk a little bit about those theoretical foundations. And then specifically, I use this in the area of ethical consumption, fair trade, also ethical design, and in ICT for D. This is part of the sort of theoretical framework where I kind of come from, which is, for me, technology is not neutral. This is kind of a starting point. It might be something that's incredibly obvious to colleagues in the round, but not to all audiences that I work with. So Castells, for example, talks about how technology is society and how society and technologies are interrelated. Lawrence Lessig up the road is talking about how norms and values are written into code. And Judith Weissman, talking from a gendered perspective, is talking about how people's access to the internet is mediated by framing institutions with specific norms and expectations. And as I go through some of the work in the study, you'll kind of see some of these things echoing again. So I've already pointed out how ICT for D relates to the D is basically development. But sometimes it's really difficult to define what we mean by development. We get asked that a lot. What do you mean by development? Often it's equated with economic growth. And that's specifically not the area that I kind of stand in. So what I'd like you to think about just for a moment is what you personally value most. Just for a moment. I'm not going to ask people to kind of disclose, but just kind of think about a moment what you value most. Most of you will have thought about something other than economic resources, as in pots of loads and loads of money. Loads and loads of money usually gets you to what you want to do. You may have thought about, having sort of exciting lives. You might have thought about travel. You might have thought about more meaningful relationships with people. Whatever is kind of your aspiration, it might be a fantastic career. But fundamentally, economic resources just form a means to that end. And one of the things we get wrong when we think in development studies about equating development with growth is that we mix up means and ends. We're not thinking about economic growth just as a mean to give people richer lives and allowing them to basically have choices. So what I argue in the book is basically that we need to move from an econocentric view to a more holistic view of development, from a linear view to a more systemic view, top-down approaches to a more kind of dialogical view, including lots of participation and participatory approaches. And also we need to get away from an environment where in sort of ICT and development, we often have a tendency to push down technology, push it out into a field, to a space where we're actually being led by users' choices and demand by users. The approach that I'm using is the capabilities approach, which has been formulated mainly by Amartya Sen, starting in the 70s and 80s, and then famously summarized in Development as Freedom in 1999. And it's also, there's a variation of that, of the capabilities approach, which is also put forward by Marta Nussbaum. But I follow largely Amartya Sen on this. So for Amartya Sen, development can be seen as a process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy, focusing specifically on substantive freedoms of the people to lead the lives they have reason to value and to enhance the real choices they have. So we're here talking about an expansion of real and meaningful choice. Capabilities, for those of you who are specifically interested in the terminology, capabilities are things that people have reason to value doing or being. I guess one of my critiques with the capabilities approach is that it uses a particular kind of language that may or may not be helpful in translation. But what I kind of emphasize in my work is freedom and choice, meaningful choices. The point is that the capabilities approach is currently the most influential alternative to econocentric versions of development. And this basically gives us a great way in to thinking about development differently. In the capabilities approach, we think about the agent differently. We think about the agent as someone who acts and brings about change, whose achievement can be evaluated in terms of his or her own values and objectives. And that means that there's a huge emphasis on participation, public debate, democratic practice, and empowerment in the sense of actually people having agency to shape the spaces that they're operating in, having choices, real and meaningful choices, and control over their lives. And that is in itself a development outcome in the capabilities approach. So real freedoms are central. It's important to recognize these individual differences that people might have, which means that the same set of resources means different things to different people. And different activities can give rise to happiness to different people. There's not just materialistic, but also non-materialistic factors. And there is also a concern for distribution, but not based on the simple idea that if everyone has got the same resources, that means the same thing for everyone. Okay? So I'm giving you a lot of kind of the theoretical background up front before we then go into the actual field study on the ground, which is the work that I did in Chile. For the operationalization of the capabilities approach, I will kind of draw on work that's specific in the ICT4D field. And here, this is basically has been an ongoing journey. So there's a whole bunch of scholars who've been trying to translate the capabilities approach into the ICT4D field. And you know, I'm one of this kind of set of scholars who are doing that translation work. This is kind of the way for me that I translate some of this. It's something that I'm not going to go into in detail right now. I'll do it in detail once I actually have a case study to lead you back to it. Okay? But broadly, I'm basically identifying classic sociology form, identifying that there's agency and structure. I'm identifying that there's different elements of structure and different resources that people might have. So there might be some resources such as financial resources and material resources, but then also some more non-material resources such as psychological resources, information, and social resources. People, individual agents, use those resources to navigate a structure, to have those choices, different degrees of choice, to achieve those development outcomes which they themselves have defined. And if they achieve those outcomes, that actually then impacts on their agency, and it impacts on structures as well if they act collectively. So there's broadly, this is a sort of a systemic map of development processes. The idea is that it allows you to help deconstruct what values are embedded if you understand how the process works. It's a mapping tool for processes, and it allows you to hopefully design for choice. And I'll try to show you how to do that today, especially this bit, and in other projects we've been also pushing in this direction. So for this study, this was a study which basically combined policy analysis at national level with some work at the local level as well. I'll come back to this slide. The study was on ICT policies in Chile, and as you can see, this is the cover of the book before MIT Press got hold of it and actually did something rather clever with a circuit board over it as well. But this is southern Chile for you. It's a country of basically 4,000 kilometers extension north to south, and it's vastly beautiful, but it poses some real challenges in terms of digital inclusion. So some outline facts, if you want. So you have, with Chile, a country, as discussed, sort of a long stretch, often called a pencil, at the southwest edge of South America, 17 million inhabitants, continued economic growth, comparatively low levels of corruption, very high literacy level. We're talking sort of 97% literacy across the country, and a good IT infrastructure, and that had to do with the fact that the government decided to put a backbone, internet backbone, north to south, running the whole length of the pencil, which of course helps tremendously with connectivity. So there's plenty of potential for ICT-assisted development. And as you can see, this is an ITU graphic from 2002, which points out how much in the e-readiness statistics of the ITU, Chile is kind of standing out in Latin America. At the same time, Chile is typically, if you want, for South America, suffering from high levels of social inequality and also high levels of regional inequality. So that means that we're also looking at a real risk for digital divides along existing divides of, for example, income, but as we'll see, also along gender lines. This was Chile's Agenda Digital, and that was a policy framework which was leading not just in Latin America but internationally, in that it actually tried to bring together policy across a whole set of different government departments into basically one streamlined ICT policy approach. And there was, everything: regulatory framework, infrastructure, sort of promoting use of ICTs in business, adapting the judicial norms accordingly, but then also trying to roll out a network of info centers into every town in Chile. 4 different models they had, but specifically the model that I'll be talking about was the model to actually have a free set of free access internet points, computers, in libraries in particular. These were state-funded, meant that people could get free access there. They could surf the web, basically sign up for half an hour internet use or an hour's internet use, and it was practically integrated into these library points. There was also policy around e-government. Lots of services were being pushed online, but specifically also e-procurement, the way that the state buys goods and services, were being pushed online in a system called Chile Compra. So in 2005, the state, within about 6 months, basically shifted all their procurement to online procurement. And there was literacy training. Remember I said 17 million Chileans, that's population. There was a literacy training, not just in all the schools, but also for 500,000 out-of-school adults, free at the point of access in these kind of info centers. So it was an integrated policy to prepare Chile and Chileans for the digital age. The policy that was designed in a context like this. This is Santiago Central Business District. This is the Santiago Underground, with Wi-Fi included. This is way advanced compared to the London Underground. Nice, airy, and Wi-Fi. This is Santiago Center, an environment where typical middle-class office workers basically walking around with their laptops stripped to them. A discourse of aspiration, social aspiration, linked to learning English, but also linked to learning IT. So there's a story here about Santiago being very much a city that sees itself as part of kind of the sort of digital new age, and very successful. Here, this is the part where the policymakers basically work. In the 7th and to 9th floor, you have the direction of Chile Compra, the e-procurement guys. And they're based in basically this center of Santiago, in this kind of aspiring city. So when I then interviewed the deputy director, he told me this: the important thing is that people are proactive and are interested in doing better than others. We have to create the conditions and the tools in which they can do that. This has to do with the economic model in which Chile is developing itself. It's the neoliberal market economy in which the lances are all point in one direction so that the most efficient will win. So that was the discourse of the policymakers. They had a clear vision here. Remember what I said about sort of plurality of the capabilities approach? They weren't so much into plurality. What they wanted was basically this was the direction of travel, but they did worry that there would be other people who wouldn't be able to keep up. So the deputy director then went on to also explain, I believe that essentially one has to invest much more in education in the region as well, especially the rural sphere, how to include it in the wagon of productivity, in the engine of development. At the same time, this is difficult because there are also, obviously, the values of those communities, values that can be from another planet, even other spiritual beliefs. So his struggle was that there would actually be also some value clashes in terms of his vision of the new Chile, which he assumed was a shared one and the modern one, and then people's values in those dark rural spaces that were still out there in the country. So welcome to the dark rural spaces in the country. This is 8 hours by bus from Santiago in the south, in a village which I'll call Algun. And obviously I had to kind of anonymize the whole field study. But this is a place with 13,000 inhabitants. As you can see, public infrastructure, including roads, is very limited. Funding is limited. It's a space where there's around 200 registered enterprises and probably twice as many still that are operating informally. So just getting tax revenue together is a challenge. It's a space, however, where when I started, they were for 13,000 inhabitants, there were already 5 cybercafes. And when a year later I stopped my study, there were 7 of them. So there was this growth of kind of private use of cybercafes. At the same time, you can see those 2 mobile phone antennas already coming up. A third one was added by the time I left. Now I'll just briefly go back to the methods just to show you what happened at the local level. I had 5 months of participant observation, 92 interviews at different stages across that year. Basically 5 months meant 5 months in 3 rounds across 1 year. We did some media usage charts, which I'll show you, basic social network analysis, focus groups, one-day survey, transects of the location, in other words, going through the location, having someone tell you the story of different places, mapping of the local infrastructure, monitoring the prices for communications in particular, and member checking, in other words, showing to your participants at the end what your results were and roughly getting an idea through different methods whether they agree or not and whether you got it wrong or what they would like to add. So this, just to continue the story, this was Algun, and the infrastructure there shows that there was a parallel universe of different technologies happening at the same time. There was also public infrastructure problems, for example, here the potholes in the road, while at the same time there was these quite flourishing cybercafes. People would have, if you want material resources, IT equipment, sometimes in their living room on display. So this is very much someone's living room. You can see how the television is integrated in that space. There's a printer, there's the computer, and it's part of the living room environment, partly because of lack of space, but mainly also because this is a status symbol, and it's integrated and it's shown off. This is the Telecenter, so this is the kind of free access internet point, where the underlying goals of the policy were very much social inclusion, allowing people to access the internet according to principles of equal opportunity and social inclusion. There was free access, small fee for printing, etc., but it was miles away from a logic that telecenters would at any point pay for themselves. This was very much state-funded access to the internet, the way that it was assumed that public libraries would be free and accessed and funded by the state. It was in that paradigm of thinking. And it was in those the space as well that free IT courses were run. Gerster and Zimmermann talk about access as being dependent on availability, affordability, and skills. So, is internet access available? Is it affordable? What is the skill set that is needed? But in the study, it became very clear that there were actually also gendered norms of access to space, and also gendered norms on the use of people's time. I'll give you an example. So this was one of the cybercafes. So I used this in my class on participant observation to just kind of get people into the habit of looking. So what you can see here is that the screens are basically turned inward. You can see how there's very little space to actually go in and behind these kind of computers. So it makes it difficult for any wheelchair users or people who kind of also have a stroller to navigate this space. You generally were looking at many young guys using this space. Some people also of other age groups, but particularly very few women going there. And there was a variety of reasons, but also this was a space where, as you can see with the kind of scantily clad youths on the beach in this corner here, representing this Coca-Cola ad, it was a space that was kind of cool. It was also slightly masculinist. It was also a space where, well, frankly, if you wanted to look at porn, you could look at porn. I'm not saying that that was the main thing that they were doing. He's kind of loading some sort of game accessory here, but that was also fully part of the package. Now, in conservative southern Chile, that's not a space where a single woman really wants to be, and certainly not hanging out. So basically, this is also a space where women would only come to effectively sit on the lap of their boyfriend. They wouldn't come there on their own. Switch over. This is a very differently coded space. This is the Telecenter, and you can see the screens are turned inwards, and immediately you can see how much, on the one hand, how much openness that creates, how much the learning experience can be that the Telecenter director can help you with whatever work you're doing. But you can also see the degree of social control. This guy, for example, is just watching what's on the other screen there. And in generally, if you were standing in line about here, you could get a rough overview, basically, what everyone was doing there. So it's not really a space where, for example, you wanted to look up sensitive health issues or something like that online. But what you can also see is how the wheelchairs basically had space to come in, how, in particularly women, have space to collaborate. A lot of that was going on where actually women would be collaborating on work on screen. And so if you contrast that with here, it's just physically a lot harder to do this in this space. So when we're talking about sort of gendered norms of access, that is actually kind of happening in these two spaces. I'm not saying that one is necessarily better. I think there's some real issues around privacy in this space. But it's really something that when we think about what kind of technology we might design, we also need to think about the spaces of interaction that are then happening. This is another example. So this is the InfoCenter director also welcoming the kind of kids of one of the users in this space. This is about the use of time. So in the beginning, it was difficult with the women because the men come home in the evening when things at the IT training courses take a bit more time. The men come home and the food's not ready. So we told the women, you go do all the housework first and leave it ready, and then you come here. Maxine Molyneux has a wonderful distinction between strategic and practical gender interests. And here what we're seeing very much is that they're not pursuing a kind of a revolutionary agenda of actually changing the division of labor in the household, which would be strategic gender interests. But what we're seeing is a very pragmatic approach, which is not rock the boat, just rearrange your time a bit. So in a sense, these are gendered norms on the use of time that have been holding women back from actually learning IT because of, for example, the timing of the courses And the InfoCenter director is aware, but she's basically not trying to tackle the big stuff. She's basically trying to work with the existing social structures and the existing gendered norms. So I'd like to introduce you to Marta. You can see I'm taking you all the way from the national level down to the community level, down to the group level, and I'm now kind of coming to the individual. So now, welcome to Marta's life. Martyr, of course, a made-up name, anonymized. She's a single mom. She's the head of household. She's got 3 kids to look after and a grandmom. She's on low income, basic education. But here's her trump card. She was a nana, a cook, and a maid in Santiago for several years, and therefore she's got excellent cooking skills. And what's possibly even more important, she knows how to present this stuff, give it fancy names, and put it nicely on plates. So she's dreaming of things like starting her catering service, or also bringing some women together to collectively actually offer a party service. She took free IT courses at the InfoCenter, and she uses the internet in the InfoCenter to research recipes to diversify her production. Particularly, she found some recipes for diabetics. And she's worked out that in this little town, increasing number of people are getting older, and increasing number of people actually have diabetes, and so forth. She needs to diversify her production. So she finds these recipes on the internet. This is the kind of classic hurrah story of the ICT4D world, where basically someone uses plain old information that they get from the internet and then use it in a different context and ... make money of it. But the internet was a much bigger deal for Marta more generally. She also hopes to organize the women so they can provide jam for local schools and hospitals. And that means that sooner or later she needs to work out how the state buys goods and services. She needs to engage with this whole procurement side of things. Problem is that she's never used the procurement system, Telecentre, in 2005, and that meanwhile also the e-procurement system is now being used to get the product sourced from the cheapest provider. And this means that they're regularly starting to source their jam, which Marta was hoping to provide, from a large distributor in Santiago in a big package with other food supplies, and they basically offered the lowest prices. That was a big distributor, and this brought costs down for the local hospital, which on one side is great. It's not good news for the local economy. There's a whole section in the book that then talks about what this means if you open up the markets to e-procurement and do this fairly quickly, what kind of effects this has for the local economy and people like Marta. Talking about people like Marta, gives you an idea about her media usage. So you can see she's using her mobile often on reception mode or through kind of texting, basically low-cost usage of mobile. There's no television or radio fees in Chile, so it's a one-off investment to get a television and a radio. She's on a black and white television, but she hasn't bothered changing. Programming quality question mark. And then there's her internet use, which is entirely linked to the Telecenter. So she lives fairly close by, geographical resources, and actually can go to the Telecenter fairly easily on a daily basis. And she does this religiously. So let's work this through in terms of the choice framework. So if we go, Marta would like more choices. In terms of her secondary choices, yes, she would definitely like more an increased income, collaborating with these other women through better and more social relationships. She would probably also like other things like easier communication, in particular with her children who are dispersed. Some of them are at boarding school. And increased knowledge, remember her diabetic recipes and so on. So she's got these different outcomes that she also pursues. she's operating in a structure, an environment where there's a discourse of the internet being something amazing and something game-changing, and also an environment where being left behind from these technologies is a very horrible thing. You don't want to be left behind. So that's kind of part of this discourse. There's these policies and programs, so the Telecenter kind of coming in, the Agenda Digital kind of influencing even her small town. There are these ongoing norms on the use of space and the use of time that are affecting how people, especially women in this community, live. And there's classic things about availabilities of ICTs, affordability of ICTs, and the skills that are needed. Her basic education actually allows her to access the internet. And then we can look at her agency position. She's in her 50s, she's female, and she's of the kind of general kind of mestizo, kind of Chilean ethnicity. And in terms of her resources, educational resources, we know basic education, information, well, she's got a set of information and she's building on it. In terms of time, because she's divorced and she's sort of in charge of her own household, she's got a degree of time flexibility. Her financial resources are very, very limited. Geographical resources, she's doing okay. She lives close to the Telecenter, and in an environment where it's okay for her to use those spaces. She can cross freely on the street. There are material resources, say, for example, her mobile handset and her television that she can use and her radio, but she doesn't have a computer. Natural resources, less relevant in this context. Cultural resources, let's say leave that for a side. There's a wonderful other example in the book as well. Social resources, she's massively connected in this little community, like through this women's group, through knowing the info center director, through actually helping about half the town out with producing the dough that people need for empanadas. Basically, she's kind of the cheat kind of helper for half the households in town. Because in an environment where you don't get a free frozen pizza very easily, you kind of go to Marta for the kind of the dough for the empanadas to kind of speed up your cooking. In terms of health, it's a little bit dodgy. And then psychological resources, this is another area where she's got loads. This is a woman who has masses of tenacity, who's come, in the book, I have a chance to describe this in more detail. She's come through a lot of adversity. And she's got capacity to envision way beyond what one might assume that she's actually had in terms of her experiencing in a small town. Probably helped by the fact that she traveled to Santiago as well for a while and got an exposure to some of this. So here it becomes quite clear that it isn't just about material resources. She's got these kind of social and psychological resources that really make a difference for her. So this means that she's using these resources to navigate the structure, to achieve particular degrees of choice. So when it, for example, it comes to using the Telecenter, she's able to use what she's got to actually navigate through the new program, which is this free Telecenter, to actually know that there's this choice existing, that she knows that this choice is there. She uses this choice as in the Telecenter and the free internet access, and she achieves through the free internet access finding out about, for example, the diabetics recipe towards increased knowledge. Hurrah, mission succeeded. Now the problem is, if you do the same thing for the e-procurement thing, the e-procurement program is being introduced. Her material resources are not such that she can basically compete at scale. So there might be a possibility of this choice of actually competing there. She's not aware of it, that she can actually use this procurement system. And frankly, it stops already there, because if you're that size, you can't compete in this particular market. So at that point, she won't achieve through this e-procurement system her hoped for result of increased income. So what I've just done is effectively map a particular case and a particular set of circumstances onto a sort of a systemic map of how the process would work. And also, you can imagine how this then feeds back with increased knowledge then affecting her information levels here and what she knows and then senses she can do. So you get an idea about how this is an ongoing systemic system. That's something I'm working on, how to then embed all of this into limited ecological resources that we all share. That's kind of just a glimpse to the future. So to conclude, we need to think about development not as growth, but as freedom of people to live the lives that they have reason to value. Individuals and communities may have very different values. Might seem obvious, but it's important to remember. And that means that we need an approach which is radically pluralistic. And this is something that the capabilities approach allows us to do. I've offered the choice framework as a tool to translate this incredibly rich and theoretical approach, the capabilities approach, into something very concrete in the empirical realities that we as social scientists might find locally. So it's an offer. I call it a living tool because I'd like people to take the bits that work for them and mash it up effectively. It's not meant to be kind of somehow preserved in aspic. It's something that hopefully can be used. I also hope that it allows us to recognize the multiple resources of income poor people and understand that these people actually have an awful lot of agency. For example, through social resources, cultural resources, and psychological resources. We shouldn't underestimate the agency of people in development, but we also need to understand that there's some significant structures that may limit that agency, and that can only be overcome with collective action over those structures. And we might want to think about then mechanisms which allow people to express choice in development. So that's open and more malleable technology, recognizing and understanding that we have joint limits that we need to negotiate, whether they are in terms of social challenges or ecological limits. We might think about voucher schemes in terms of allocation, and then participatory aspects such as participatory budgeting. We may actually decide that we want to pay more and buy local. That might be a collective value decision. And in terms of participatory design of technology, if we want to be truly pluralistic and value sensitive, I think we need a much more participatory approach towards design. And that would be then the next step to do that collectively with users. So thinking development beyond growth and planning and designing for choice are my kind of big two takeaways. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
I actually have no idea how much time we have for questions because I don't have my watch.
12.
12. We have 12 minutes. So this is the talking stick. If you have a question, I'll walk it to you, and then you'll pass it to another person.
Thanks for a super interesting talk. I'm wondering, you started out talking about the goals at the national level of this sort of, we're going to be neoliberal and we're going to make lots of money and the people who can make money the best are going to be the winners. And then you have rich examples where that doesn't play out. Are there ways in which those two models come into conflict in specific instances, or is it just sort of a conceptual disjuncture that plays out on two different levels that don't really talk to one another at all?
I've so far found that the best platform for dialogue for that particular sort of discursive conflict, if you want, has been the space of state procurement. Because it's supposedly where we collectively as taxpayers and citizens make decisions about how the government is supposed to spend money in our name. And there are approaches where you basically just say, you want value for taxpayers' money. So you want to optimize this in a sort of narrow sense. You want to buy basically the cheapest at stable quality, effectively. But for a small town like Algun, where a lot of small enterprises, there aren't any medium enterprises, but small enterprises are just about hanging on. This is a matter of the survival of that town for in the next 50 or 100 years. Probably more 50. So whether actually even the local public administration will actually kind of go and buy externally from that town or internally from that town matters tremendously for the future of this space. And there are some arguments, for example, ecological arguments of not shipping, in one case, for example, school furniture from China into Santiago and then 8 hours by truck basically down into that into the school, when next door there's a whole bunch of carpentry businesses. The ecological argument would be in your favor, as well as the argument around, you know, the jobs of the parents of the kids who go to said school. So it's these kind of discussions that would have to be had. And I think when we're talking about public money, we're actually talking about a much broader set of outcomes that you may want to achieve with that public money. And so it's a really interesting space to observe this. And we currently have with said Chile that really gets quite a tough write-up in the book. Said Chile has currently adjusted also their criteria towards ecological and social norms. So we're having a really rich dialogue with them on this journey to actually looking at criteria that they're buying from. So this is a really interesting space to watch.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. I guess I'm not familiar with the choice framework, but I'm having a hard time seeing how it's all that different from a more economic framework. And it seems like, I guess I still feel like there's a Western sort of individual preference, utility maximizing framework in both of them. Mm-hmm. And I guess I wonder if there's tensions then if you try to import this framework. It feels very Western still to me, mm-hmm. and not all that different than a, you know, economic actor type, other than maybe they're not just exercising choices through markets. But I guess, you know, are these frameworks actually, you know, is it us again imposing just a slightly different framework on other parts of the world that comes out of the West? Or is it, you know, is it really actually a significant departure from, I mean, I see there's like a macro, it seems like development has been thought of as an aggregate kind of GDP type phenomenon, and this is more nuanced, but it still seems to share the same basic underlying assumptions to me.
I think I'd like to take that into two parts. So one is this question of whether, you know, there's a great distinction between this kind of work and a focus on growth. I would immediately point out yes, because you basically have, instead of focusing on this bit as the kind of agreed focus of what people want, you have the primary outcome being choice, and then a whole set of options that people might choose. So there I would say there's a huge distinction. Now, on the second part, which is about, you know, there's a whole, the framework focuses quite heavily on the individual. And I'm struggling at the moment in the next step, the current work that I'm doing, to also translate this on groups and democratic discussions in groups and scaling this up in terms of groups. So that's the kind of next challenge. But for individuals, one of the big debates we're having in development is whether a focus on the individual and individual choice is something sort of ingrained in the Western view, or whether it is something that is much more shared and universal. And I think this is a very long discussion, but one of the things that is arguably underplayed in that space is what happens when you move away from the individual to groups. Basically, in relative terms, the powerless are going to lose as soon as you scale up from the individual. And I'm particularly interested in the marginalised and powerless. And so there's a real cost to thinking about groups and what does the community want, or what does the household want, because we may not hear from specifically the women and the kids in the household. What we'll hear is, you know, the guy speaking, male head of household, speaking about the household, or the headman speaking about the community. And if we assume that, well, we as Westerners don't quite understand how collective everyone's thinking, we're ending up in a space where we're taking the collective in some way as read, and we're expecting that there's some kind of cohesion in that collective in terms of their values. And I've seen too many situations in my fieldwork where the values that were expressed in the name of the collective did not match up with the values of the individual that was being marginalized in that group process. So I think there's some real challenges there for us in terms of understanding how power works in these groups. And if we don't have time to kind of expand on this, we can maybe chat a bit longer afterwards, but it's worth looking at the literature around adaptive preferences, which is a big literature in the capabilities approach, how people basically adjust what they want according to what the pressure of the group is. Yeah? More later, I'd say. Yeah?
I'm really glad you went down to, I'm really glad you went down to a specific instance case, especially the remarkable resilience and resourcefulness of a female thinking about, even at a small level, of entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. Have you been able to keep in contact and find out where she, well, since you said 2005, 2006, certainly with, I don't know if there's more market penetration or the price of tablets and computers goes down, so there's more, penetration, or is she able to follow through with such a great, wonderful, I mean, she's fixing a pain point and she have a chance to upgrade herself, but where is she now?
Right. So, the official fieldwork period is well and truly over, just for, the rigorous field study, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, the informal contacts in many ways continue, which actually, for example, for Marta, the health challenge has become a lot more difficult. So there's some aspects here which we haven't even covered, where basically a lot of this, also the psychological resources, can be directed just to overcome that. Yes. For the director of the Info Center, there's a lovely story basically where her work in particular has been recognized, and she now runs the regional library service, which is an integrated service for both the telecenters and the libraries. She's basically making the case that there can be kind of a joint and holistic thinking about how to integrate libraries and telecenters as we move along and as technology evolves. So I think that's a really interesting story where you see technological change also then affecting the way that people think locally, and how that then translates into some sort of strategic thinking for the next decades. I think what's important in the Chilean case here, talking about the agency of this particular woman leader, is that there is a political will to actually invest in public knowledge infrastructure, which is something unusual in many countries, yes. So including in the UK, where libraries are being closed down, et cetera, et cetera. In Chile, there is this commitment to investing in a knowledge infrastructure, but it used to be split between telecenters and libraries, but there is some integrated thinking going on. So it's a space worth watching, I think. And someone ought to do the research.
We have time for one more question. Or we can go eat.
I was just curious about the women's group that you mentioned that she was particularly involved with, and I was trying to parlay that into Christo's question about thinking beyond the individual. So rather than necessarily thinking about these quite hierarchical structures of household and village, these transverse structures like that women's group that you spoke of, where if you could tell us a bit more about that and where that sits within something like a choice framework, how does a collective that's sort of voluntary formed in that sort of way, how does that mesh with this kind of framework?
Mm-hmm. welcome to one of my kind of current theoretical research puzzles. So I'll share with you how far I've got, which bits I have. I don't have the puzzle solved by any means. So one is, collectively, we can never, with the capabilities approach, assume that any two people in this room have an identical value structure. So what we may be able to agree on is some kind of joint objectives or joint purpose. And that would then basically allow us to kind of build collective action around a joint purpose, even though we don't necessarily agree on everything. Which kind of meshes interestingly with also Amartya Sen's work on justice. So the idea of justice, if I had to sum it up in a sentence for, basically a student seminar, I'd basically say it's very much about focusing on the bits that you can all agree are super unjust, and start with those. So it's this building shared purpose, which then would allow for collective action. There's another aspect, which is this idea of pooling resources. So some of these resources can be very effectively pooled. And there's a massive literature on how social resources can kind of be pooled, and you can create kind of these famous weak links by just kind of linking also together some of these networks. There's other aspects like information, where you can have wonderful discussions as to whether there are forms of information that actually devalue when they're entirely shared, versus information that when you share it is kind of collectively shared also can actually become a shared resource. So for each of these resources, you have to work out very carefully how that works out collectively and individually. So, I find it a fascinating challenge to kind of try and scale up, if you want, but it's by no means, neither theoretically nor practically simple. But I think for me, it's a starting point that for an individual, it works. And that allows me to make sense of a very complex reality in the field. And it gives me a basis to start then thinking about how it then works collectively. And I'm absolutely certain that in order to make some changes here, in this space, in the structures, you actually need to think about collective change, collective action, and collective agency. And that's what motivates me to kind of dig deeper into how to kind of conceptualize this effectively. Thank you.
So join me in thanking Dorothea.